Ever since the commissioning of an Atari 2600 game based on Raiders of the Lost Ark in the United States popularized them, licensed games based on media have always been around as a part of computer and video game software releases. But in Japan, the origins of licensed games start even earlier, and the stories behind them would be surprising and varied. From a suddenly famous television franchise getting a feature film, and the large number of fans who started making programs based on it, to a company that started out doing software conversions from Avalon Hill and ending up developing tons of licensed titles for a famous film studio, to a media behemoth trying to leverage the shows they were involved in, with both an unsuccessful launch of a computer system and an unsuccessful launch of a video game console variant. To other examples like an anti-war classic adapted into 2 games that weren't even in the language the show was broadcasted in, and an arcade game and type-in conversion with a disputed history. These earliest adaptations were extremely diverse and experimental, with the urban legends surrounding some of the games becoming arguably more famous than the games themselves. These are some of the stories of how anime adaptations came to personal computers and early consoles in Japan. In the early 1970s, as computers began to become more utilized in colleges on large mainframe systems, students would start to design games that could run on them. One of these games was an unofficial creation based on Star Trek, designed in Irvine, California by Mike Mayfield. A tricky tactical war game that involved destroying enemy ships while moving around quadrants on a map. Iterated on hundreds of times, this title would also have its source code ported in popular programming books, including a variant called Super Star Trek, published in the famous 101 Basic Computer Games by David Ahl. And clones of this Star Trek game began to show up on every computer you could think of, with some of them making their way over to Japan. But at that time, Japan didn't really have a lot of fans of Star Trek outside of enthusiast circles, as the show had just had one running on television in the 1970s at that point. But just as Star Trek gained popularity in reruns over here, there was another franchise that was gaining popularity in Japan around that time in exactly the same way through reruns: Space Battleship Yamato. And with the release of a feature film compilation of the first series in 1977, the popularity exploded. According to the first anniversary issue of ASCII magazine in July 1978, a lot of times in Japan, this prolific Star Trek game was changed slightly by local hobbyist programmers to be about the battleship Yamato instead. The author also remarked in the same issue that sometimes creators forgot to take out the Star Trek elements, meaning that the Yamato fought the Klingons in quite a few of them. In response to this, and in order to make something a bit more original, there would be created in that same issue what could arguably be called the first licensed game based on an anime. A type-in program done as a promotion, adapting a scene from the film Farewell Space Battleship Yamato, where the ship had to fight off enemies while its wave-motion gun charged up. This very simple game would get copies and variations, including a revision in the very next issue for TK-80 boards. And another one in IO magazine that would come out about a year and a half later, which ironically combined it with Super Star Trek to make something a bit more elaborate. This precedent would lead to more licensed type-ins later on, but not before another story that started in the 1960s would create many more licensed anime software products in a much more official capacity. In the USA around 1968, a tabletop gaming company known as Avalon Hill was struggling after an ill-advised expansion into children's toys. Having learned a harsh lesson that they needed to narrow their focus, they began to concentrate on one thing and one thing exclusively: tabletop war games, particularly ones set in World War II. Meanwhile, at about the same time on the other side of the Pacific, the head of a taxi company had decided to sell his business and enter into a new burgeoning industry: computer consultation. with hires being utilized to assist in the development and maintenance of large computer systems. Although the first version of his company started out as purely a talent pool for computer-related staffing. Called CSK Computer Service Kabushiki Kaisha, it became an extremely profitable company throughout the 1970s. And in the early 1980s, they would branch out into computer retail, with multiple stores in Tokyo eventually branching out into 5 locations. The owner of CSK, Isao Okawa, would himself become a very important figure in gaming history later on. But not before brokering some critical licensing deals that would set an interesting precedent of how media would be adapted into games. Part of the reason why CSK's stores expanded so rapidly in the late 1970s to the early 1980s was that computers had begun to make their way into people's homes, with systems like the Apple II and Commodore PET doing well in the United States, and the PET in particular getting a bit of a cult following overseas, as well as machines like the PC 8001 doing comparatively well domestically in Japan. As that was happening, many companies were beginning to look at software development and digital representations of tabletop games that were already popular, with war games being a huge part of that. Avalon Hill would take notice of this and form their own division called Microcomputer Games, no doubt spurred on by the mixed response but good sales of a game called Computer Bismarck for the TRS-80 and Apple II, the first digital version of a tabletop war game, which despite mixed reviews had at least proven that tabletop conversions were feasible. And in a surprising move, they would recognize that Japan as well was about to experience a personal computing boom, and sign a licensing agreement with CSK and Isao Okawa to bring Avalon Hill strategy games to Japanese shores. But that wasn't the only deal that CSK was signing at the time. CSK would also work with Toei Video in bringing in licensed adaptations of media that Toei had rights to, everything from anime to popular films from that time. This created some unusual ingredients, a good number of intellectual properties that could have digital representation, and a great deal of software to be converted that programmers could learn from. But what do you do when you need to combine these varying genres of film and anime with multiple specific game types like dungeon crawling or strategy games? You adapt the Toei properties into them, whether it would be logical on the surface to do so or not. CSK would create sub-brands to do this and reach out into the software market. For war games, they would create the brand CSG, or Computer Simulation Games, and work almost exclusively with another company called Kiyosu Sho. For adult titles, they would create the brand Lovecom, who worked with the fledgling studio Hot B, among others. For adaptations, though, they would create the brand FILCOM, and with the help of Kia, that's where some of the earliest licensed adaptations start to form. The earliest CSK title found for this video was Ashita no Jo for the FM7, and it was arguably CSK's first foray into this sort of publishing. Since Kia was also quickly gaining experience adapting and converting the Avalon Hill war games that Microcomputer Systems were pumping out, and had even converted these systems into Japan-exclusive strategy games like the game Shinsengumi, they utilized the systems derived from sports-based strategy games from Avalon Hill to make a turn-based boxing simulator featuring Joe Yabuki. Other titles would follow a similar idea of development, including strategy-adventure hybrids based on the Battle Without Honor of Humanity gangster films, and a tactical stealth game based on the Female Prisoner Scorpion film series. They would also dip into education, with some English tutors featuring Arare from Dr. Slump. But one of the most notable anime and manga properties they began to adapt was Golgo 13, from the legendary manga about Duke Togo, the world-traveling assassin. Already a media behemoth with 2 live-action films, multiple OVAs, and one of the best-selling manga of all time at that point. Kia and CSK would actually make 3 games based on Golgo 13, and the way they went about it shows the unusual nature of adaptation and having to bolt these properties onto existing genres. These Golgo games would all form a trilogy, and they are not dumped online, but from early catalogs we can get a sense as to what the games were about. The first was a text adventure called Khrushchev's Ghost, and it was unusual in that you didn't even play Duke Togo in the game, instead playing as another individual, finding out about bizarre happenings in the company that he was working for. The second was a tactical strategy game, as Golgo enters the picture for the first time, and the third appeared to have been some type of strategy hybrid with adventure and stealth elements, if the catalog is anything to go by. However, towards the end of 1983, CSK's rapid expansion into computer software was not entirely successful, and retail stores began to suffer from a huge problem with overstock. Without good curation, the retail stores failed, and part of that failure would cause restructuring. As part of this business change, the trademark for the war games would switch to Kia, who would be listed as the publisher from here on out, and the FILCOM brand would be shuttered. As for the other games that Kia was now developing, they would be overshadowed by a new player on the market, as a designer named Ko Shibusawa, in reality actually named Yoichi Arakawa, had broken away from his company's current adult titles and RPG prototypes, with a mix of his own previously developed titles. Taking elements from his previously developed war games, and from his own developed investment simulation game, to make a war game called Nobunaga's Ambition. And the release of that around the same time as all of this was happening with CSK would mark Koei as a huge player for strategy audiences. Koei's star would only continue to rise after this, and their early releases would overshadow their predecessors over the next few years, including Kia's strategy games. Don't feel too bad for Okawa and CSK though. This closed door would lead to the open window of the acquisition by Okawa and CSK of a little company called Sega. And Okawa would stay there in leadership roles for many years. He even released his own cover song CDs internally annually while he was at the company. But despite these events and the move away from adaptation on CSK's part, that wouldn't be the only early Golgo game, and it wouldn't just be from this company. Others would get into this as well, some of them large media conglomerates. Pony Canyon had recently had success in personal computing with an adaptation of the film Genma Tyson, known as Harmageddon over here. A very primitive RPG adventure hybrid that mostly consisted of some well-drawn graphics and a lot of yes-no questions. It's fundamentally a bunch of binary choices run against character stats across about 4 chapters, and it's quite short, but it was surprisingly popular. They had also released another licensed product, not from an anime though, called Spy Daisakusen, which was a dungeon crawler adaptation loosely based on the Mission Impossible franchise. These games were both programmed by Yoshinobu Takahashi, also known as Pianta, who was actually a student at that time at the Chiyoda Institute of Technology, and revealed in an interview with Technopolis that he had been contracted out by Pony Canyon to make games based on existing franchises. While Spy Daisakusen is highly unusual in both its interface and presentation, it's essentially almost a roguelike, with item selection, random stat generation, and then storming a randomly generated 60-room building to gather documents and escape, along with some very basic turn-based combat and skill checks. It moved the RPG outside of the fantasy genre for arguably the first time. These games had given Pony Canyon a framework to work from, and their next titles would take inspiration from these previous releases to create something more complex. They would elaborate upon the coding of these 2 games to create 2 maze adventure hybrids featuring Golgo 13, the Moretti Family Massacre, based on elements from the OVA Golgo 13 The Professional, and The Wolf's Lair, based on a popular arc from the manga that even got a long out-of-print English translation. And while it might be strange to make 2 maze-like adventure games with a claustrophobic dungeon crawler atmosphere about a long-range sniper, they actually work pretty well, having a tense atmosphere as Golgo infiltrates a villa in the first game and a compound in the second. The games even make an attempt at simulating 3D movement through animating Golgo's footsteps, but they're still fundamentally text adventures at heart. The first game in particular also had a reputation for extreme difficulty, something Pony Canyon turned into a selling point. Taking out advertisements in magazines challenging people to beat the game and featuring testimony from people that couldn't. The designer, Hideaki Isozaki, even pushed the difficulty further by making the game's solution different for each version of the game. And even for versions released on different physical media for the same system, with the floppy versions having different solutions than the cassette ones. The second game in this series, Wolf's Lair, refined this further. That one is archived as an MSX game, and increased animations to both communicate information better to the player and up the tension of the game, with the player now seeing in the lower right-hand corner Duke Togo shoot and be shot at. These wouldn't be the only Golgo games, though. A somewhat bizarre Space Invaders variant with you controlling a little Duke Togo head at the bottom of the screen was released by Compaq, a software house run out of I.O. magazine. And this was actually published as a type-in game as well. Licensed type-in games done as promotions were actually fairly common for early Japanese computers, but there would be a varied approach as to how licensing was handled with each of them. Sometimes there would be an official licensed title printed in the magazine to promote a show or film. And sometimes the games would be contest winners and submissions that would later end up being sold, as most of these magazines actually had software divisions that would release some of their type-ins as cassettes or discs. As a matter of fact, Yoshinobu Takahashi, the designer of Spy Daisukusen, would eventually become editor-in-chief of Login magazine, a primary source for some of these type-ins. A good example of a show that benefited from this approach was Urusei Yatsura, which had multiple games that were independently developed that show the sorts of genres the type-ins and contest submissions usually covered. These would include Lovely Chaser, an action puzzle game where Lum has to keep women away from Ataru via electric shocks, and also maze games, in which Lum just simply chases Ataru around. Additional winners and type-ins include platformers, with Lum sometimes being the protagonist and sometimes being the antagonist, and simple draw-the-character programs or sliding puzzle games. Due to Lum's incredible popularity, she would show up in early PC gaming a lot in general as well, sometimes showing up in magazines and even in commercials to show the capability of computer systems. And while other shows would get simple variants of this sort of program, like a Lin Minmei art program called Miss Macross, some franchises would draw in hobbyists to make creations that were quite a bit more elaborate. Gundam itself would be another property that tended itself to hobbyist adaptations, and in addition to some combat games, there were 2 type-in games made for the Gundam franchise for the FM7 that were published in books, both carrying the name Simulation Game Gundam. Dispute exists over which one was the copyrighted one and which one might have been a fan game, but we do know that they were both war games, with the first one interestingly taking place in a 3-dimensional environment, and the second being a more traditional hex-based war game. But Bandai themselves and the studios that work with them would have their own unusual history with early licensed games, with 2 of their earliest being a surprising attempt at trying to do multiple genres at once. 2 of the most interesting and prominent of the early releases were attempts at text adventures with some hybrid sequences from other genres. Both of the games, Roll Venture Gundam Gundam Stands on the Ground, and Roll Venture Gundam Fly Gundam, would use high-quality PCM audio and use it as a selling point for the game, although sadly the digitized copies and floppy conversions aren't able to reproduce this well while being emulated. While technically the games are quite nice for the time with full-color illustrations, the text parser is very limited. Interestingly, both games were in English, making them pretty easy to pick up and play, even if the unusual nature of the coding meant the vocabulary stayed very basic. That being said, though, there were more than just text sections. A very simple combat minigame was present in the first game as well. This would be elaborated on in the second game, with a better combat system and even a dungeon crawling section similar to the Golgo games. The reason for the games being somewhat unstable was probably due to the games being developed by Rapport, a studio made not out of seasoned programmers, but by the staff of Animec magazine. These two games didn't sell well enough to justify their cost though, and a planned third game in the series would never come to fruition. But Bandai and the companies they worked with had other early attempts beyond the Roll-Venture Gundam series. A lot of the earlier Gundam games were clones, but nonetheless remain interesting. Zeta Gundam for the FM7 is a side-scrolling mech game that's very resemblant to Thexter. And I was surprised to discover that Mobile Suit Gundam Jetstream Attack for the FM7 was a combination tactical map and side-scroller, meaning that some of the ideas in the Diva series may have originated here in this title. Bandai themselves would try to capitalize on Gundam on the hardware side, with less than ideal results. One attempt was a gaming-focused computer called the RX-78, named after the Gundam itself. While comparable to other computers of the time carrying a Z80 processor and developed in collaboration with Sharp, which would have at least guaranteed some coverage on Pasacon Sunday, a TV program whose Sharp heavily sponsored, it did not sell well, possibly because it failed to distinguish itself from its contemporaries, and possibly in part because it came out in the same month as the Nintendo Famicom. It did have a Gundam game exclusively for the system, though, and it's a Space Invaders clone called Battle of Luna. Interestingly, one of the designers of the RX-78 was the grandson of Eiji Tsuburaya, one of the fathers of Tokusatsu, and one of the people primarily involved with the creation of Godzilla and Ultraman. After his stint at Bandai ended, the grandson, Hideaki Tsuburaya, would much later serve as president of Tsuburaya Productions for about a year, before being forced out by the company board. He would write a scathing book about his experiences called Ultraman is Crying, and bad blood still exists at Tsuburaya Productions between relatives to this day. But the RX-78 wouldn't be the only unusual piece of hardware released by Bandai around that time. The earliest was probably a hardware port of the Emerson Arcadia, an extremely early video game console that was released around the same time as the ColecoVision and licensed to Bandai in Japan. Sources on the Arcadia's origins vary, with some sources stating Bandai licensed it from Emerson Radio, others stating that it may have been developed by Philips, and others stating that the license may have come from a Hong Kong company called UAL. Bandai's variant of the console, though, would have 4 exclusive games, all internally developed, and they would all be anime adaptations. These would include a Space Invaders clone called Mobile Soldier Gundam, a Macross game called Super Dimension Fortress Macross that's also a Space Invaders clone, with a bit more maneuverability, and a second level, a side view section where you have to blow up the core of a ship, a maze game based on Doraemon, starring the least enthusiastic version of him I've ever seen, and an extremely frantic arcade game based on Dr. Slump, where Arade the robot must stop aliens from building a UFO by following them around and screaming at them. Unfortunately, this console didn't sell well either, a misfortune that befell most Emerson Arcadia variants across the world. But there was one other major company that had some unusual stories about their first branded games, Taito. While Taito's actual first game affiliated with something else was 280ZZ Zap, a game based on the Datsun 280Z, their first anime adaptation was an arcade game featuring Lupin III. Lupin III's history with adaptation has its own rocky story behind it, as Hiroshi Suzuki, the programmer of the game Manbiki Shonen, states in John Sepeniak's Untold History of Game Developers that he believes that ideas were taken from his shoplifting stealth game series and used for the Lupin III arcade game. This arcade game would get a conversion, and it would once again be a type-in and also published by CPU Software, with a bit of a graphical downgrade that still plays more or less the same. Lupin would also be tied to an early console, this time a bit more successfully, with a well-regarded title for the Epoch Super Cassette Vision, another console that would have a variant outpaced by the Famicom's launch. And while the Dragon's Lair-like clone that featured Lupin, known as Cliffhanger in the United States, would become the most famous of the early Lupin games, it wasn't the only adaptation of Castle of Cagliostro to show up on personal computers. Yet another dungeon crawler adventure hybrid would be made for the PC-88 and FM7, and it would try its best to render some full-color screens from the film, which would result in some very slow rendering speeds. With item selection, skill checks, and stats, it shows clear inspiration from Spy Daisakusen, although it's much easier to understand it visually. There would also be a side-scroller for the MSX, Arsène Lupin III, and the Castle of Cagliostro, which was a completely different game, playing more like a conversion of the MSX version of Castlevania, also known as Vampire Killer, with Lupin exploring the castle and using various tools to get through enemies. While we're talking about Miyazaki, though, early games based on his films also deserve a bit of a look, as a persistent urban legend popularized by the book Miyazaki Recommendations by Juzo Osaka states that Miyazaki saw a game adaptation of Nausicaa and became so furious at its low quality that no anime of Ghibli's ever got an adaptation in game format again. But this urban legend gets complicated by the fact that there were actually 3 games released as Nausicaa adaptations, and the legend never tells you which one was viewed. As well as the fact that Miyazaki has had failed attempts at working with Nintendo due to scheduling, and Studio Ghibli itself has occasionally dipped into gaming with products like Ni no Kuni. The PC 6001 and MSX games are side-scrollers, but they both at least try to mix up the formula a little bit. The MSX game, Nausicaa's Forgotten Game, has some additional sequences involving going to Doruk and distracting Ohm, and the PC 6001 game, Nausicaa's Close Call, takes a stab at recreating the Baby Ohm sequence from the film. But the PC-88 version is by far the strangest, having 2 sections, one where a badly drowned Nausicaa knocks on doors to collect items, and one that appeared to have been a glider simulator that is incredibly difficult to decipher how to even play. Other miscellaneous type-ins would show up during these times, such as this breakout variant featuring Miki Momo. But from what we have still preserved in some way, these were some of the more notable adaptations from the earliest years of personal computing in Japan. As you can see, if there's one overarching theme, it would be safe bets, with only very established franchises getting games in these series. But even if the franchises were safe bets, the gameplay certainly wasn't. And the variants these games brought, simplistic though they were at times, would be iterated on and generate some unique titles in the future. The dungeon crawling and puzzle mix of the Golgo games would be duplicated in levels of the more action-oriented Famicom games. Gundam would go from these simplistic beginnings to games in any genre you could think of. And Macross would get another game called Super Dimension Fortress Macross that was worked on by CSK Software Products veterans, tying the very beginning of all of this into the next millennium. And the ideas of killer app launch titles, though they failed here in Bandai's case, would be a practice that remains repeated to this day. So while they were not the wild successes that these companies anticipated, these games still remain a critical first step. See you next time. Special thanks to the users on the Patreon, including Andro, Matt Leffler, James B., Peter Tushar, Mooware, and Josh. As always, subscribing to the Patreon will give you access to certain bonuses, and this time around, it'll be a short video on some of the history of Tsuburaya Productions, which should be finished about 2 weeks out from the premiere of this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
You